Dr. Delcy Allison Jr., I want to know history or legend in the Gospel of Matthew. You've written a commentary series on this particular gospel. So I'd like to know what happened and what didn't happen. But before you answer that question, everybody, we recorded 8 30-minute, very high quality recordings, a course on the quest for the historical Jesus, on Jesus studies, New Testament studies, what's going on in the New Testament, many historical figures, E.P. Sanders, John Dominic Crossan, all the way back to like Schweitzer, David Friedrich Strauss, back to the Protestant Reformation, and it's very detailed. Lots of information in the packet. Eventually, we will do a Q&A session on Zoom for those who actually sign up for the course. You will get notified of it. Go ahead and jump on board. Paula G is blown away by this course, so I hope you will as well. Matthew, you've already mentioned, of course, the first few chapters, birth narratives, that you would say, hey, I don't even touch this as if this is solid historical stuff. There could be memory, parents' names, things like that, but that could just be simply other sources where we're aware of these figures, and then we concoct kind of narratives to kind of fulfill scripture, if you will, in Matthew. What else in Matthew that really sticks out to you? I'm sure we could go on forever about details when you wrote commentaries on this. What really sticks out to you and goes, this sounds so heavily mimetically connected to maybe a trope that we find in the Hebrew scriptures that I just don't find this historical. I find this more as beauty in the literature in comparison to fulfill scripture.
Well, so if you read Matthew's account of Jesus's death, this is 27:51 through 53. When Jesus dies, the sun goes dark, and then there's an earthquake, and then graves are opened, and then people get out of their graves. And after Jesus rises from the dead, they go into Jerusalem, and they introduce themselves to people. Now, I think if this were true, this would be the most astounding event in human history. That's the first thing. It would be more astounding than Jesus' single resurrection. And I think it would have been the centerpiece of early Christian apologetics. And there's nothing else about it at all until we get Matthew. So I think that this is a legend. Not only that, but you mentioned the scriptural business. So if you look at the language carefully, my view is that Ezekiel 37 is echoed here. That's the story about the bones being revived and brought back together. And early Jews understood this, whatever the intention of the prophet Ezekiel, as a picture of the coming eschatological resurrection. There's also language there from the end of Zechariah 14, where the Mount of Olives splits on that day. And if you know anything about Jewish tradition, including Jewish artistic tradition, you will know that these two passages merge together. And what happens is the Mount of Olives splits and the dead come out. And actually, the dead from all over the world are rolling through underground tunnels so they can come out on the Mount of Olives. And these are two texts about resurrection and the final day, and Matthew's language echoes both of them. So he's plugging into this tradition about end-time resurrection. Really interesting. Why does he want to move the end-time resurrection or part of it to Jesus's end? That's an interesting question. I'd also know, I don't know if you've ever been to Jerusalem, Derek, but if you stand on the Mount of Olives and you look down to Jerusalem, the entire hillside is covered by graves. Yep. It's covered by tombstones. And that's because of this text from Zechariah, because that's where the resurrection of the dead is going to happen, or that's where it's going to begin. And so people have wanted to be buried there for centuries. So I don't think that's history at all. More importantly, I think that Christians have read it as history, and I think Matthew took the story as history. I see nothing in his text that tells us he thought this was parabolic or Haggadic. The other thing is less scripture. I mean, it pops out as just the most obvious thing of all, is the guard at the tomb. So there's no guard at the tomb in Mark, no guard at the tomb in Luke, no guard at the tomb in John. And this guard serves an obvious apologetical function. It serves to disprove the possibility that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples or by tomb robbers. And it just looks obviously apologetical to me. And if it were true, if there was some memory there in Matthew, I think it's inconceivable that there's no trace of this in Mark or Luke or in John. So those are two things that come to mind. One more, I suppose I could add. There are some details about the suicide of Judas, in Matthew. And if you look at Matthew's story, it's different than the story about Judas's end in Acts 1. There's also a third version where he gets run over by a wagon in a tradition attached to Papias. I think that early Christians probably didn't know what happened to Judas, but they knew it must have been horrible. And so we've got 2 or 3 different versions of a horrible end that came to him. So again, I don't see history there.
I must ask one more while we're on Matthew, moving into Mark, because I think this is an important one. The way that the Mount of Transfiguration is portrayed in Matthew, what do you do with that as we're transitioning into Mark? It's an interesting one.
Okay, so to my mind, this has a clear Mosaic interpretation. So not only does Moses show up, but if you go back to the Hebrew Bible, on Sinai, Moses glows. And when he's on Sinai, a cloud comes down, as happens in the Gospels, and God speaks from the cloud, as happens in the Gospels. And Moses goes up into the mountain after 6 days on the 7th day. That is that's the chronological note in Mark 9 that this event happened after 6 days. So you can go through and you can line up these parallels between Moses and Jesus. And you might say, as David Friedrich Strauss said, well, that's the end of it. That's fine. Here's the odd thing, and you're not going to hear this from anybody else, but you are going to hear it from me. So if you know anything about Roman Catholic canonization proceedings, you will know that tons of people have sworn under oath that they saw so-and-so glowing or shining. So, when Catholics get sainted, there's a process they go through, and they interview people who knew them, looking for signs of sanctity and so on. So lots of stories about glowing people are legends. No doubt about that. No doubt about that at all. I can't tell you anything about the historicity of the tradition that Francis of Assisi glowed. But here's the thing. Not only do we have these tons of firsthand testimonies, but I've known 2 people personally who claim that they saw a religious saint or an adept glow. So one of my friends was with a Sufi master once, and he was in a hotel room, and they were the only ones there, and they were sitting opposite each other in lotus position on mats, not saying anything. And he told me the story about how his face began to glow and glow and glow, and it filled up the room. Okay, so maybe he was hallucinating, but it's very interesting that he himself believed this. He was a friend of mine. He talked to me. I interviewed him about it and so on. But here's the other thing. What do you do with this? So I have a son who practices Tibetan Buddhism. And several years ago, he had an audience with 2 other people with one of these old holy men from, Tibet, some ancient of days who was revered by people. And they had an audience with this character. And my son says that during this event, this conversation, that he began to glow, and then he began to glow and glow and glow, and it was bright and so on. And my son tells me that after they left, he and the two people he was with talked to each other, and they all said, yeah, we saw it. He was glowing. And of course, my son, he's my son. He's a rationalist. He looks around. Is there sunshine coming through the window? What's going on here? He concluded that it was actually coming from the person. So it's possible my son is lying to me, but I actually think he's telling the truth. Now, I have no explanation for this whatsoever, but I have decided myself that sometimes people see other people glow. I have no explanation for that. And I do have a few stories of people in groups that see somebody supposedly glow. So here's the possibility. I can't prove this. I don't even know what I think, but it's possible that you could have some such experience like that, however you explain it, subjective, objective, whatever. And I think if you had a story of somebody, or who knows, maybe a couple of people seeing Jesus glow at some point in time, it would then be written up in terms of the memories of Moses. So this could be another story, kind of like the baptism. I say could be. I can't prove this. I can't establish this. But it's something that people don't think about enough, because the people who argue that this happened typically are just Orthodox Christians who want to just accept it as it was. And then there are the skeptics on the other side who just say people don't glow and that's the end of it. I actually know that people at least claim to see something like what you have in Mark 9. And it's a surprisingly well-attested phenomenon. It must be pretty common if two people I know have told me about it. So that's another possibility to throw in there. I think all the Mosaic things are there. I think it's clearly been written up with this in mind. There's no way to show David Friedrich Strauss was wrong and that is the only root of this experience. But I could also see something happening, some weird event happening, and then it be written up in terms of Mosaic motifs.